Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about kings or wars or philosophical debates that lasted longer than the average human lifespan. No, tonight we're talking about something far more important. Something humanity discovered completely by accident. And then refused to stop doing for the next 10,000 years. Alcohol. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's slowly drift into tonight's slightly fermented history together. We begin, as all questionable human decisions do, with fruit. It's somewhere around 10,000 BCE. The world is still mostly wild. Humans are not in charge of anything yet. We don't have cities, we don't have writing, and we definitely don't have responsible life choices. What we do have, is hunger. And fruit. Lots of fruit. Now here's the problem with fruit. If you leave it alone, it doesn't stay fruit for very long. It rots. And when it rots, something magical happens. Yeast, tiny, invisible organisms that no one asked for, begin eating the sugars inside the fruit. And as they eat, they produce alcohol. Of course, early humans didn't know any of this. All they knew was this. Sometimes, fruit made you feel different. Picture it. A small group of early humans wandering through a forest. They find a pile of fallen berries or overripe fruit sitting on the ground. It smells a little strange. Slightly sweet. Slightly wrong. But they eat it anyway. Because of course they do. And then something happens. At first, maybe nothing. Then a little warmth. Then laughter. Then one of them trips over absolutely nothing and finds it hilarious. Another starts talking way more than usual, about things that don't matter, to people who are no longer listening. And one very confused individual is staring at a tree like it just told a joke. This is humanity's first experience with being drunk. Now here's the important part. At no point did anyone say, "Ah yes, fermentation. The chemical conversion of sugars into ethanol." No. They said something much more scientific. Eat that again. And just like that, a pattern begins. Humans start noticing that certain fruits, when left alone, become something better. Not more nutritious. Not safer. Just, more interesting. And in a world where survival is constant stress, where everything is trying to kill you, and where your daily schedule includes, avoid being eaten. More interesting, is good enough. But humans were not the first to discover alcohol. Not even close. Animals were getting drunk long before we showed up. Monkeys, elephants, birds, even insects have been known to eat fermented fruit and completely lose control of their lives for a few hours. There are documented cases of elephants eating fermented marula fruit and then stumbling around like they just made several bad decisions in a row. So technically, alcohol is not a human invention. It's more like a natural trap. And humans walked straight into it. Now, at this stage, drinking is completely accidental. No one is trying to get drunk. There are no breweries. No taverns. No one saying, "It's been a long day." Because every day is a long day. But slowly, very slowly, humans begin to connect the dots. They start to realize that if you leave certain foods or liquids sitting for a while, something changes. And that change can be repeated. This is where things start to get dangerous. Because once humans realize something can be repeated, we stop doing it by accident. And we start doing it on purpose. Somewhere, at some point, a human being made a decision. A terrible, brilliant decision. Instead of eating the fruit immediately, they waited. They let it sit. They watched it change. And then they ate it anyway. This person, whoever they were, is one of the most influential figures in human history. And also, probably very confused. Now imagine explaining this to someone who has never experienced it. Why are you eating the bad fruit? Because it makes me feel good. How? I don't know. Is it safe? Probably. And yet, despite the uncertainty, this behavior spreads. Because here's something you need to understand about humans. We are extremely good at sharing bad ideas. Especially the fun ones. So over time, different groups of humans, in different parts of the world, all begin discovering the same thing. Rotten fruit is not always a mistake. Sometimes, it's an experience. Now, at this point, alcohol is still weak. Very weak. We're talking about naturally fermented fruit with low alcohol content. Enough to feel something, not enough to completely ruin your life decisions in one evening. That comes later. Humans are still in the "this is interesting" phase, not yet in the "hold my drink and watch this" phase. But something deeper is happening. Alcohol isn't just changing how people feel. It's changing how people interact. Because for the first time, humans are experiencing something that lowers their fear. That softens tension. That makes social interaction easier. And this matters more than you think. Because early human life is stressful. Constantly. You have limited food. Constant threats. Uncertain survival. Trust is fragile. But then, you eat the strange fruit. And suddenly, things feel lighter. Conversations flow. Laughter happens more easily. And for a brief moment, life is not just survival. It's something else. Something closer to enjoyment. And this is where alcohol stops being an accident. And starts becoming a tool. Not for building. Not for hunting. But for something much stranger. For changing the human experience itself. Now, we move forward. Slowly. Because history does not rush. And neither will we. As humans begin settling down, forming early agricultural societies, something interesting happens. They stop relying on wild fruit. And start growing their own food. Grains. Barley. Wheat. Rice. Stable. Predictable. Controlled. But grains come with a problem. They are boring. You can eat them. Sure. But they don't exactly inspire joy. No one has ever looked at a pile of barley and thought, "This will improve my evening." Until someone added water. And waited. So, we left off at a very important moment in human history. When someone looked at a pile of grain and thought, there has to be more to this. And there was. We move now to around 7,000 to 6,000 BCE. Humans are no longer just wandering around eating whatever doesn't immediately kill them. They've started settling. Farming. Building early villages. Life is becoming structured. Predictable. And, unfortunately, a little dull. Because farming, despite being one of humanity's greatest achievements, is incredibly repetitive. You wake up. You tend crops. You hope it rains. You try not to die. Repeat. Now imagine doing that every single day, with no music, no entertainment, and absolutely no concept of weekends. You would also start experimenting with whatever is lying around. And what's lying around? Grain. Lots of it. Barley. Wheat. Early rice. Staple foods of civilization. Reliable. Filling. Emotionally uninspiring. But here's where things take a turn. Someone, again, a mystery genius with questionable judgment, mixes crushed grain with water. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was laziness. Maybe they just forgot about it. Either way, the mixture sits. And sits. And then it starts to change. The same invisible yeast from before shows up again. Uninvited. Unseen. Hungry. It begins consuming the sugars released from the grains. And once again, it produces alcohol. Now the result is not exactly what you'd call beer today. It's thick. Cloudy. Probably full of bits. More like a suspicious porridge that makes you feel unusual. But early humans try it anyway. Because at this point, that's basically our entire strategy as a species. Try everything once. Then try it again if it feels good. And it does feel good. This is the birth of beer. Or at least, beer's very chaotic ancestor. Now here's where things get interesting. Because unlike fermented fruit, which depends on nature, grain-based alcohol can be controlled, produced, repeated, scaled. And humans love anything that can be scaled. So instead of waiting for fruit to rot randomly, people start making this grain drink on purpose. Over and over again. Improving it slightly each time. Or at least, convincing themselves they are. And suddenly, alcohol is no longer an accident. It's a process. We are now in Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Which is a polite way of saying. This is where humans started figuring things out, and also making things complicated. In this region, around 4000 BCE, we see something remarkable. People aren't just drinking this early beer. They're organizing their lives around it. Beer becomes part of daily existence. Not a luxury. Not a rare treat. A necessity. And before you judge them, you need to understand something. Water, at this time, is not always safe. It can carry disease. It can make you very sick. Sometimes, fatally. But beer? Beer is boiled during the brewing process, which accidentally kills a lot of harmful organisms. Meaning, beer is often safer than water. So when ancient people are drinking all day, they're not just partying. They're surviving. Still. They are also, very clearly, enjoying it. In fact, beer becomes so important in Mesopotamian culture that it earns its own goddess. Ninkasi. Yes. A deity dedicated entirely to fermentation. There's even a hymn written in her honor. Which is not just poetry. It's also a beer recipe. Imagine worshipping something so much. You turn instructions into a song. The process goes something like this. Grain is baked into bread. The bread is crumbled into water. Left to ferment. And eventually, you get beer. It's inefficient. It's messy. It's absolutely revolutionary. And people drink it constantly. Morning. Afternoon. Evening. Workers are paid in it. Literally. Instead of money, laborers receive daily beer rations. Which makes sense. Because money doesn't exist yet. And beer is both valuable, and immediately useful. Imagine finishing a long day of building early civilization. And instead of a paycheck, someone hands you a container of cloudy liquid and says, "This is your salary." And you're just, okay with that. Because honestly, it's not the worst deal. Different strengths of beer even exist. Stronger brews for special occasions. Weaker ones for everyday hydration. Which is a very polite way of saying functional drinking. Now here's an important detail. Early beer is not filtered. At all. It's thick. Chunky. Full of grain residue. So people don't sip it elegantly. They drink it through straws. Yes. Straws. Not because it's trendy. But because if you don't, you end up chewing your drink. Archaeologists have even found ancient drinking vessels with built-in straws. Some made of precious metals. Because if you're going to drink questionable liquid, you might as well do it in style. And just like that, drinking becomes social. People gather. They share. They talk. They relax. And something new emerges. Not just survival. Not just agriculture. But culture. Because alcohol does something subtle, but powerful. It changes how people connect. It lowers barriers. Encourages conversation. Creates shared experiences. And in early societies, where life is hard and uncertainty is constant, that matters. A lot. Now, of course, not everything is perfect. Even at this early stage, humans begin noticing a pattern. Drink a little, feel good. Drink more, feel very good. Drink too much. And suddenly you're lying on the ground explaining your thoughts to someone who left hours ago. But moderation is not exactly humanity's strongest trait. Still, the benefits seem worth it. So beer spreads. From Mesopotamia to surrounding regions. Different cultures begin developing their own versions. Using whatever grains they have available. And with each new variation, alcohol becomes more embedded in human life. Not as an accident. Not even as a luxury. But as something almost essential. Now, while Mesopotamia is perfecting its cloudy, bread-based beverages, another civilization is quietly watching. Learning. And, as usual, preparing to do everything on a much larger scale. We move now to the land of the Nile. Order. Structure. Monumental ambition. And, of course, a workforce that needs to be kept motivated. Welcome to ancient Egypt. Where alcohol isn't just a drink. It's part of the system. So, we've arrived in ancient Egypt. A land of gods, gold, and extremely ambitious construction projects. Because when you think of Egypt, you probably think of pyramids. Massive stone structures built in the middle of the desert, for reasons that can mostly be summarized as because the pharaoh said so. Now here's the question no one asks enough. How do you convince thousands of people to drag enormous blocks of stone under the hot sun, day after day, for years? You could try motivation. You could try discipline. You could try divine purpose. Or you could give them beer. And that's exactly what they did. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just common. It was foundational. Workers, including those building the pyramids, were often paid in daily rations of bread and beer. Not small amounts either. We're talking multiple jars per day. Which means that one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history was built by people who were, at the very least, slightly buzzed. Not drunk. Let's be fair. This wasn't chaos. This was controlled, low-alcohol beer. More like a thick, fermented grain drink that kept people hydrated, fed, and just relaxed enough to not question their life choices too deeply. Because again, clean water was unreliable. Beer was safer. So drinking wasn't indulgence. It was routine. Imagine waking up at sunrise. The desert already warm. You eat some bread. You drink some beer. You go to work moving stones that weigh more than your entire future. You take a break. More beer. At some point, it stops being a treat. And becomes part of your biological expectations. Now, Egyptian beer was similar to Mesopotamian beer. Thick. Cloudy. Unfiltered. But the Egyptians refined it. Slightly. They experimented with flavors. Dates. Honey. Herbs. Little improvements here and there. Not because they were chasing perfection. But because if you're drinking something every single day of your life, you might as well try to make it taste better. Beer was everywhere. Homes. Temples. Work sites. Even children drank it. Before you panic. It was very low in alcohol. More like a nutritional drink than anything else. Still, it does mean that from a very early age, Egyptians were introduced to the idea that this slightly strange-tasting liquid is normal. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Which is how alcohol quietly becomes part of culture. Now, the Egyptians didn't just drink beer. They also discovered wine. Wine was different. Wine was special. Beer was for everyone. Wine was for the wealthy. The elite. The people who didn't have to carry rocks for a living. Wine came from grapes, which required more care, more resources, and more patience. Which immediately made it more valuable. And humans have always had a simple rule. If something takes more effort, it must be better. So wine became a symbol of status. The pharaohs drank it. The nobles enjoyed it. And naturally, they made sure everyone knew. Jars of wine were labeled with incredible detail. Year of production. Region. Quality. Basically, the ancient version of saying, "This is a very good bottle." Meanwhile, the average worker was still drinking beer out of a clay jar with a straw, trying not to swallow half the ingredients. And yet, both drinks served the same deeper purpose. They made life more manageable. Now, alcohol in Egypt wasn't just for daily consumption. It was also deeply tied to religion. Because of course it was. Everything was. Offerings to the gods often included beer and wine. Temples brewed their own. Priests used it in rituals. Because if you're trying to communicate with divine beings, it probably helps if everyone involved is just a little more relaxed. There were even festivals dedicated to drinking. One of the most famous involved honoring a goddess associated with chaos, destruction, and, interestingly, intoxication. Hathor. According to myth, there was a time when humanity annoyed the gods so much that destruction was considered a reasonable solution. Hathor was sent to deal with it. And she did. Very enthusiastically. But then the gods changed their minds. They decided maybe wiping out humanity was a bit extreme. So they needed a way to stop her. Their solution? They dyed beer red, to look like blood. And spread it across the land. Hathor drank it. A lot of it. And eventually, she got so intoxicated that she forgot about destroying humanity entirely. Which means that, according to Egyptian mythology, alcohol literally saved the human race. Not through wisdom. Not through strength. But through distraction. A very human solution. And every year, people celebrated this event. By drinking. Extensively. Festivals where people would gather, sing, dance. And gradually lose track of how serious they were supposed to be. Because here's something important. Ancient societies worked hard. Very hard. Life was labor-intensive. Unpredictable. Often exhausting. So when moments of celebration came, they leaned into them. And alcohol became the center of those moments. A way to step outside the routine. To feel something different. To connect. To forget. Even if just for a little while. Now, of course, this isn't all peaceful and balanced. Because humans, once again, start noticing something. Drink a little. You feel good. Drink more. You feel great. Drink too much. And suddenly you're trying to explain the meaning of existence to a clay jar. The Egyptians were aware of this. There are texts that warn against overindulgence. Advice that sounds surprisingly modern. Do not get drunk in the tavern. Do not lose control. Do not say things you will regret. Which strongly suggests people were absolutely doing all of those things. Because if there's one constant across all of human history, it's this. We are very good at ignoring good advice. Still, alcohol remains. Not banned. Not feared. Just managed. Integrated into daily life. And as Egyptian civilization flourishes, as pyramids rise and temples expand, as art, writing, and culture develop, alcohol is always there. In the background. Quietly influencing everything. But Egypt is not alone. Because while the Nile flows steadily, beyond it, other civilizations are evolving. Thinking. Questioning. Arguing. And, naturally, drinking. We move now toward a world that takes everything, including alcohol, and turns it into a discussion. A debate. A performance. Welcome to ancient Greece. Where people don't just drink. They analyze it. Now, we leave behind the steady rhythm of the Nile, and arrive in a place where things are a little less organized, and a lot more opinionated. Welcome to ancient Greece. A land of thinkers. Debaters. And people who could turn even the simplest activity into a philosophical discussion. Including drinking. Now, the Greeks did not invent alcohol. Not even close. By the time they arrived, beer had already been around for thousands of years. Wine, too. But what the Greeks did was give drinking a personality. Because in Greece, drinking was not just something you did. It was something you talked about. Analyzed. Structured. And, of course, turned into a social event. This event had a name. A very important name. The symposium. Which sounds formal. Almost academic. And in a way, it was. A symposium was a gathering of men, usually elite, usually very confident, who would meet to drink wine, discuss ideas, and slowly lose track of both. Imagine a room. Soft lighting. Couches arranged around the edges. People reclining, because sitting normally is apparently too simple. There's music. There's conversation. There's wine. Always wine. But here's the key detail. The wine was diluted. Yes. Diluted. Because drinking unmixed wine in Greece was considered barbaric. The Greeks believed that proper drinking required balance. Control. Moderation. Which is why they mixed wine with water. Sometimes a little. Sometimes a lot. And then they drank it. Slowly. At least. That was the idea. Because in reality, things didn't always stay controlled. At first, the conversation would be thoughtful. Topics like, what is virtue? What is truth? What is the nature of reality? Very serious. Very important. Then, as more wine was consumed, the tone would shift. The questions became slightly less philosophical. Do you think that statue is judging us? Why does bread exist? Am I speaking too loudly? And eventually, the conversation would dissolve entirely into laughter, storytelling, and someone insisting they've just had a very important realization that no one else understands. Which, to be fair, is still how these things usually go. Now, the symposium wasn't just about drinking. It was about structure. There was often a leader of the gathering. Someone responsible for deciding how strong the wine should be. How much people should drink. When the evening should end. This person had an important role. Because without structure, things could get out of hand. And even with structure. They often did. Still, the Greeks believed that drinking, when done properly, could lead to insight. To clarity. Which is a very optimistic interpretation. But also, not entirely wrong. Because alcohol, in moderation, does something interesting. It lowers inhibitions. Encourages openness. Allows people to speak more freely. And in a culture built on discussion and debate, that can be useful. At least until someone says something they can't take back. Now, wine in Greece was more than just a drink. It was tied to identity. To culture. To religion. Because, naturally, there was a god for it. Dionysus. Dionysus was not a calm, measured deity. He was associated with chaos. Celebration. Madness. The kind of energy that starts as a pleasant evening. And ends with someone dancing barefoot under the stars, convinced they've transcended reality. Festivals in his honor were intense. Music. Dancing. Drinking. Large groups of people abandoning normal behavior in favor of something far less predictable. These events weren't about moderation. They were about release. Because even in a society that valued logic and reason, there was a recognition that humans need an escape. A break from thinking. From structure. From control. And alcohol provided that. Now, not everyone approved. Even in ancient Greece, there were people who looked at all this and thought, this seems like a bad idea. Philosophers debated the role of drinking. Some praised moderation. Others warned against excess. One famous figure, Socrates, was said to be able to drink large amounts of wine without appearing affected. Which sounds impressive. But also raises questions. Was he truly unaffected? Or was everyone else just too drunk to notice? Either way, he became something of a legend. A man who could participate fully in the symposium. Without losing control. An ideal that many admired. And very few achieved. Because here's the reality. For most people, alcohol doesn't lead to perfect balance. It leads to stories. Stories of things said. Things done. Things regretted. And yet, despite all of that, it remains. Because the benefits, the connection, the relaxation, the shared experience, outweigh the occasional poor decision. At least in the moment. Now, as Greek culture spreads, through trade, through colonization, through influence, so does their relationship with alcohol. Wine becomes a central part of Mediterranean life. And eventually, another civilization takes notice. A civilization that doesn't just adopt ideas, but expands them, scales them, turns them into systems. Welcome to Rome. Where drinking becomes less philosophical and more practical. We leave behind the thoughtful debates and carefully diluted wine of Greece. And arrive in a place that looked at all of that and said, yes, but what if we made it bigger? Welcome to ancient Rome. An empire of roads, armies, laws. And an impressive ability to take ideas from other cultures and make them feel like they were Roman all along. Including drinking. Now, the Romans inherited wine culture from the Greeks. But they didn't just copy it. They expanded it. Because Rome didn't do things halfway. If Greece had symposiums, Rome had banquets. Large, elaborate gatherings filled with food, conversation, entertainment. And, of course, a lot of wine. Picture a Roman dining room. Couches arranged around a low table. Guests reclining, just like in Greece, because apparently sitting upright never made a comeback. There's music. Servants moving quietly. Plates of food that go on for longer than necessary. And wine. Endless wine. Now, like the Greeks, the Romans often diluted their wine. But here's the difference. They didn't always care that much about moderation. Because in Rome, drinking wasn't just about balance. It was about status. Display. Excess. If you were wealthy, you showed it. Through your house. Your clothes. Your guests. And very clearly. Through how much wine you could provide. Because nothing says power like making sure everyone around you has more than they need. Banquets could last for hours. Sometimes days. Courses of food arriving one after another. Wine flowing continuously. And as the evening went on, things would become less structured. Conversations would grow louder. More animated. Someone would start telling a story that goes on far too long. Someone else would interrupt with a better story. And somewhere in the room, a person is quietly questioning all of their life choices. Which means, very little has changed. Now, while the elite enjoyed their extravagant banquets, the average Roman also drank. Wine was not limited to the wealthy. It was everywhere. But, like most things in Rome, quality depended on your position. The rich drank fine, aged wines. Carefully stored. Carefully labeled. The poor drank something, less refined. Lower quality wine. Sometimes watered down. Sometimes mixed with herbs or other ingredients to make it more acceptable. Still, it served its purpose. Because once again, clean water was not always reliable. And fermented drinks were often safer. So drinking remained part of daily life. But here's where Rome adds something new. Scale. Because Rome was massive. Stretching across continents. Connecting regions that had never been connected before. And wherever Rome went, wine went with it. Vineyards were planted across Europe. Production increased. Trade expanded. Wine became one of the empire's most important goods. Not just a drink. But an industry. A system. And with that system came something familiar. Regulation. Because if there's one thing Rome loved, it was rules. Laws about production. Laws about trade. Even unspoken rules about behavior. Because while drinking was accepted, losing control completely was not admired. At least not publicly. Roman culture valued discipline. Order. Control. Especially among men of status. So while banquets could be excessive, there was always an expectation that you would maintain some level of dignity. Which, of course, didn't always happen. Because alcohol has a way of testing boundaries. Now, like the Greeks, the Romans also tied alcohol to religion. Wine played a role in rituals. Offerings. Ceremonies. And they had their own version of a wine god. Bacchus. Very similar to Dionysus. But with a slightly Roman twist. The festivals in his honor, known as Bacchanalia, became famous for being less restrained. What started as small, private religious gatherings gradually turned into large, chaotic celebrations. Full of drinking, dancing, and behavior that made the authorities uncomfortable. Because there's a point where celebration starts to look like disorder. And Rome, despite all its indulgence, did not like disorder. So eventually, the government stepped in. Restrictions were placed. Gatherings were limited. An early example of something we've seen many times since. People discover something enjoyable. Take it a little too far. And authorities try to bring it back under control. With mixed success. Because here's the truth. Once something becomes part of culture, it doesn't disappear easily. It adapts. moves, finds new spaces. And alcohol had already become too embedded in Roman life to remove. So it stayed. In homes. In taverns. In quiet gatherings and loud celebrations. Through all of it. An invisible constant. Now, as long as the empire stood. This system held. But empires don't last forever. And when Rome began to fall, it didn't just lose power. It lost structure. Trade routes weakened. Cities declined. Systems collapsed. And with that, the organized world of Roman drinking began to change. But alcohol itself didn't go anywhere. It simply moved into a very different kind of world. A world less organized, less controlled, and, in many ways, more unpredictable. We move now into the medieval period, where life becomes harder, stranger, and somehow, still very committed to drinking. So, Rome fades. Slowly at first, then all at once. The roads are still there. The buildings, some of them, still standing. But the system, the structure, the sense that someone, somewhere, is in charge of everything. That disappears. We enter what historians politely call the medieval period. Which is a nice way of saying things got complicated. Across Europe, life becomes more local. More uncertain. More improvised. Large cities shrink. Trade slows down. And for the average person, daily life becomes harder. But one thing remains. Alcohol. Because here's the thing about alcohol. It doesn't require an empire. It doesn't need roads or armies or centralized control. It just needs grain or fruit, water, time, and a human willing to say, let's see what happens. So even as everything else changes, people keep brewing. Now, in medieval Europe, beer becomes dominant. Wine is still around, especially in southern regions where grapes grow easily. But in colder, northern areas, beer takes over. Because grain grows almost everywhere. And grain, as we've already established, is just waiting to become something more interesting. So villages begin brewing their own beer. Small scale. Local. Unregulated. Every household might have its own version. Every village, its own taste. And here's the important part. It's not very strong. Medieval beer, often called small beer, has low alcohol content. Because again, the goal isn't to get completely drunk. The goal is to have something safe to drink. Because water is still a problem. Rivers are used for everything. Washing. Cooking. Sometimes, less pleasant activities. So drinking untreated water is a risk. Beer, on the other hand, is boiled. Fermented. Safer. So people drink it all day. Children included. Which sounds strange now. But at the time, it's practical. You wake up. You drink beer. You work. You drink beer. You rest. You drink more beer. Not to escape reality, but simply to exist within it. Now, brewing becomes a daily task. And interestingly, much of it is done by women. In many medieval communities, women known as aleuves are responsible for making and selling beer. They brew at home. Sell to neighbors. Supply local demand. It's one of the few economic roles available to them. And for a while, it works. Until, of course, it becomes profitable. And once something becomes profitable, other people get involved. Often with opinions. And rules. But we'll get to that. For now, imagine a small medieval village. Simple homes. Narrow paths. Fields stretching out beyond. And somewhere in the center, a tavern. Because if there's one thing humans consistently build, it's a place to gather and drink. The medieval tavern is not fancy. Wooden tables. Rough benches. Dim light. The air filled with the smell of food, smoke. And something vaguely fermented. People come here after work. To eat. To talk. To rest. And, of course, to drink. This is where stories are told. News is shared. Arguments begin. And sometimes, continue longer than necessary. Because alcohol doesn't just relax people. It also makes them very confident in their opinions. Which, in a time with limited entertainment, is enough to fill an entire evening. Now, taverns also serve another purpose. They create community. In a world where life is difficult, unpredictable, often exhausting, having a place to sit, drink, and talk matters. It's not about excess. Not always. It's about connection. About stepping away from the constant demands of survival. And sharing a moment with others. Even if that moment involves someone loudly explaining something no one asked about. Now, of course, not everyone approves. Because just like in every era, there are concerns. Religious authorities, in particular, have complicated feelings about alcohol. On one hand, it's part of daily life, even used in rituals. On the other hand, too much of it leads to behavior that is not exactly encouraged. So sermons are given. Warnings are issued. Do not drink to excess. Do not lose control. Do not forget your duties. And once again, people listen. And then do whatever they were going to do anyway. Now, monasteries play a surprisingly important role here. Because monks, despite their reputation for discipline and simplicity, become some of the best brewers in Europe. Monasteries brew beer not just for themselves, but for travelers, for the poor, for trade. They refine the process, improve consistency, experiment with ingredients. Because if you're going to dedicate your life to routine, you might as well get very good at one of the few enjoyable parts of it. And slowly, beer improves. Still not modern beer, but better, cleaner, more predictable. Now, around this time, something new begins to appear. Not just beer. Not just wine. But something stronger. Because humans, as we know, are not content with good enough. If something works, we push it further. Which leads to one of the most important developments in the history of alcohol. Distillation. But that is where things start to change. Because once alcohol becomes stronger, everything else changes with it. Up until now, alcohol has been manageable. Beer, wine, naturally fermented, relatively low in strength. Something you drink throughout the day, without completely losing track of who you are. But humans are not known for stopping at manageable. At some point, someone looked at beer, looked at wine, and thought, this is good, but what if it was more? And that thought changed everything. We enter the world of distillation. Now, distillation is not simple. It requires heat, containers, timing, patience. Which means it doesn't appear randomly. It develops slowly. Through experimentation. Through curiosity. Through people doing things with liquids that seem unnecessary. Until suddenly, they're not. The earliest forms of distillation likely appear in parts of the Middle East and Asia. Used first for perfumes, medicines, alchemy. Because of course, the original goal wasn't to get drunk. It was to understand transformation. How substances change. How to extract something pure from something ordinary. But eventually, someone applies this process to alcohol. And what comes out is something very different. Stronger. Much stronger. Instead of a mild, steady effect. This is concentrated. Intense. A small amount does what large amounts used to do. And suddenly, alcohol is no longer just part of daily life. It becomes an event. In medieval Europe, distilled alcohol begins to appear more clearly around the later Middle Ages. At first, it's not called whiskey, or vodka, or anything familiar. It has a much more dramatic name. Aqua vitae. Latin for water of life. Which is ambitious. And also slightly concerning. Because anything described as water of life is probably either very important or about to cause problems. At first, aqua vitae is treated as medicine. Of course it is. Everything new is medicine at first. It's prescribed for various ailments. Pain. Fatigue. Melancholy. Which, conveniently, are all things that alcohol appears to improve. At least temporarily. Monks and scholars produce it in controlled settings. Carefully. Deliberately. But as knowledge spreads, so does production. And here's where things begin to shift. Because once something strong becomes accessible, control becomes harder. A drink that was once mild and steady is now powerful and immediate. And humans, as always, need time to adjust. Which they don't take. Instead, they experiment. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life drinking weak beer, suddenly encountering distilled alcohol. They take a sip, pause, and then say something along the lines of, "That's different." And then, probably take another sip. Now, reactions vary. Some people are cautious. Others, less so. And it doesn't take long for the effects to become clear. Stronger alcohol changes behavior faster. Decisions happen quicker. Mistakes happen sooner. And consequences arrive earlier than expected. But it also has advantages. It's easier to store. Easier to transport. Doesn't spoil as quickly. Which makes it valuable. Traders begin moving it across regions. Different cultures adapt it. Experiment with ingredients. Grains. Fruits. Anything that can be fermented can now be distilled. And slowly, different traditions begin to form. Early versions of what will one day become whiskey. Vodka. Brandy. Not quite the same yet. But recognizable. And as these drinks spread, they begin to carry identity. Not just something you drink, but something that represents where you're from. Your region. Your culture. Now, of course, with stronger alcohol comes stronger reactions. Authorities begin to notice. Because while beer and wine could be part of daily life, distilled spirits are harder to ignore. They lead to faster intoxication. More visible effects. And once again, we see a familiar pattern. Concern. Debate. Attempts at control. Some regions embrace it. Others restrict it. But none of them eliminate it. Because by now, alcohol is too deeply woven into human behavior. It's not just a drink. It's ritual, social connection, escape, celebration, and occasionally, a very questionable decision. Now, as we move forward in time, the world is changing again. Trade expands. Exploration begins. Cultures connect in new ways. And alcohol travels with them. Across oceans. Into new lands. Adapting. Evolving. Becoming something even more complex. Because the story of alcohol is no longer just about survival. Or even culture. It's about industry. Global movement. And the beginning of something that looks a lot like the modern world. Now at this point, we've reached a turning point. Up until now, alcohol has spread slowly. From village to village. From culture to culture. Carried by trade, migration, and curiosity. But now, the world is about to become much more connected. We enter the age of exploration. Ships begin crossing vast oceans. Trade routes expand beyond anything seen before. And wherever humans go, they bring two things: their habits and their drinks. Because if you're about to spend months on a ship, surrounded by water you can't drink, with food that gets worse every day, and no real escape, you're going to need something. And that something is alcohol. In fact, on long sea voyages, alcohol isn't just comfort. It's strategy. Water stored on ships goes bad quickly. It becomes unsafe. Unpleasant. But alcohol lasts. So sailors are given daily rations. Beer. Wine. And increasingly, stronger spirits. Which makes life at sea slightly more bearable. And decision-making slightly more questionable. Now, as these ships travel, they don't just carry goods. They carry ideas. Plants. Practices. Including the knowledge of how to produce alcohol. And as different regions connect, something new begins to happen. Alcohol becomes global. Different ingredients from different parts of the world start to mix. Sugar from the Caribbean. Grains from Europe. Fruits from various climates. And with distillation now well understood, new types of alcohol begin to emerge. Rum. Brandy. Refined spirits with distinct identities. Each tied to a place. A process. A history. And as production increases, so does availability. Alcohol is no longer just local. It becomes trade. Business. Industry. Something that can be produced in large quantities. Moved across oceans. Sold to entire populations. And with that scale comes something familiar. Dependence. Because when something becomes widely available and consistently used, it stops being occasional. It becomes routine. In many places, drinking shifts again. From something tied to meals or rituals, to something more frequent, more casual, and sometimes more excessive. Now, governments begin paying closer attention. Because alcohol is no longer just a cultural habit. It's economic. It generates revenue, taxes, trade value. And at the same time, it creates problems. Public disorder. Health issues. Social disruption. Which leads to a new phase in the history of alcohol. Control. Laws are introduced. Regulations enforced. In some places, drinking is encouraged. In others, restricted. But just like before, it never disappears. Because the pattern remains the same. Humans discover something that changes how they feel. They use it. They enjoy it. They push it too far. And then try to manage it. Over and over again. Now, as we move closer to the modern era, alcohol becomes something even more familiar. Not just a necessity. Not just a ritual. But a choice. Something people seek out. For relaxation. For celebration. For escape. And with that shift comes a deeper awareness. Because by now, humans understand more about the effects, the risks, the consequences. And yet, despite all that knowledge, the behavior doesn't change as much as you might expect. Because alcohol isn't just physical. It's emotional, social, psychological. It's tied to how we connect, how we celebrate, how we cope. And those things are not easily replaced. So it remains. In different forms. Different strengths. Different meanings. But always present. From the first accidental bite of fermented fruit to the global industry it becomes, alcohol has followed humanity. Every step of the way. Not as a leader. Not as a solution. But as a companion. Sometimes helpful. Sometimes harmful. Always, there. And if you zoom out, look at the entire story. It's not really about alcohol. It's about us. Because this pattern repeats everywhere. We discover something new. We experiment. We enjoy it. We build systems around it. We struggle to control it. And then, we keep using it anyway. Not because it's perfect. But because it does something we value. It changes how we feel. And for a species that thinks as much as we do, worries as much as we do, struggles as much as we do, that's powerful. So when did people start getting drunk? Not in a single moment. Not in a single place. But gradually. With fruit on the forest floor. With grain in early villages. With beer in ancient cities. With wine in thoughtful conversations. With spirits in expanding worlds. And ever since, we've been figuring out what to do with it. Sometimes wisely. Sometimes, not. But always. Very human. Now. The fire is low. The room is quiet. And history, as always, keeps moving. So rest. And let the story settle. Because tomorrow, humans will wake up. And continue doing exactly what they've always done. Trying to make life just a little more interesting. You might think the story of alcohol ends once it becomes global. Once it becomes industry. Once it becomes normal. But there's one part of this story that doesn't belong to any one civilization. It belongs to all of them. The morning after. Because as long as humans have been getting drunk, they've also been waking up the next day. And immediately regretting at least one decision. This is not a modern invention. This is ancient. Universal. Timeless. Somewhere in early Mesopotamia, a person woke up after drinking too much beer. Stared at the ceiling of their very simple home. And thought. That was a mistake. They didn't have a word for hangover. But they definitely had the feeling. A heavy head. Dry mouth. A vague sense that something important was said, or done, or both. And a strong desire. To never do that again. Which, historically, lasts about a day. Because here's the strange part. Humans quickly learned that alcohol had consequences. Physical ones. Social ones. And yet, that knowledge didn't stop the behavior. It just became part of it. Warnings appear throughout history. Ancient texts advising moderation. Philosophers cautioning against excess. Religious teachings encouraging restraint. All of them saying, in different ways, be careful. And all of them being politely ignored. Because alcohol creates a very specific cycle. Anticipation. Enjoyment. Overuse. Regret. And then, eventually, a return to anticipation. It's not logical. But it's consistent. Now, different cultures tried to manage this cycle in different ways. In ancient Greece, they diluted wine. In Rome, they emphasized dignity and control. In medieval Europe, they kept alcohol weak and constant. Each system had the same goal. Enjoy the benefits. Avoid the consequences. And each system worked. Until it didn't. Because the line between enough and too much is not fixed. It shifts. Depending on the person. The situation. The mood. And once that line is crossed, history repeats itself. Now, over time, humans began trying to fix the morning after. Remedies appeared. Strange ones. Ancient Egyptians suggested mixtures of herbs and bread. Greeks recommended more diluted wine. Romans, unsurprisingly, had opinions involving food, rest, and denial. Because if you ignore the problem, it might solve itself. Which is optimistic. Other cultures tried more creative approaches. Eating certain foods. Drinking specific mixtures. Avoiding light. Avoiding people. Avoiding memory. Some of these methods worked a little. Most didn't. But the effort itself is interesting. Because it shows something important. Humans didn't just accept the consequences. They tried to manage them. To soften them. To recover faster. Which allowed the cycle to continue. Now, as alcohol became more widespread, more accessible, more powerful, this cycle became more visible, more noticeable. Not just individual experiences, but societal patterns. Communities dealing with overuse. Authorities responding. Debates emerging. And once again, the same questions appeared. How much is too much? When does use become misuse? Should it be controlled? Or left alone? And just like before, there were no simple answers. Because alcohol is not just a substance. It's a behavior. And behaviors are complicated. They're tied to emotion. To culture. To identity. You can regulate a drink. But it's much harder to regulate. Why people drink. And that's the part that never really changes. Because whether it's a Neolithic human eating fermented fruit, a Mesopotamian worker drinking beer, a Greek philosopher at a symposium, or a modern person at the end of a long day, the reason is often the same. To feel different. Not better, necessarily. Not worse. Just different. And sometimes, that difference is enough. Even if it comes with a cost. Now, if you look back across all of history, across every culture, every era, you'll notice something. Alcohol never disappears. It changes form. Changes meaning. Changes context. But it never leaves. Because it fills a space. That humans keep creating. A space between reality. And how we experience it. And as long as that space exists, something will fill it. For thousands of years. That something has often been alcohol. Not because it's perfect. But because it's available. And, at least for a little while, effective. So the story continues. Not as a straight line. but as a loop. Repeated across time. Across cultures. Across individuals. A very human loop. And now, as the night settles, as everything becomes quiet again, we return to where we started. Not in a place, but in a moment. A human, standing somewhere, holding something, taking a sip, not knowing exactly what will happen next, but willing to find out. And honestly, that's how most of history happens. So, we've talked about empires, civilizations, gods, workers, philosophers, and entire societies built with a drink always nearby. But most of history doesn't happen in grand moments. It happens quietly. In small rooms. At simple tables. In places no one bothered to record. Because for every king raising a golden cup, there are thousands of ordinary people, holding something far less impressive. A clay mug. A wooden cup. A chipped bowl that has seen better days. And inside it, something fermented. Not perfect. Not refined. But enough. Imagine a small home in medieval Europe. The day is ending. Work is done. Or at least, paused. There's no dramatic event. No celebration. Just quiet. A person sits down. Maybe alone. Maybe with family. They take a sip. Not to celebrate. Not to escape completely. Just to mark the end of the day. To create a boundary between effort and rest. And this moment, simple as it is, happens again and again. Across centuries. Across cultures. A pause. Because that's something alcohol has always offered. Not just intensity. Not just celebration. But a transition. From work to rest. From noise to quiet. From thinking to not thinking quite as much. Now, of course, not every quiet moment stays quiet. Sometimes, one drink becomes two. Then three. And suddenly, the calm turns into something else. But just as often, it doesn't. And those are the moments that rarely make it into history books. Because they're too ordinary. Too small. But they matter. Because history isn't just shaped by big decisions. It's shaped by habits. Repeated actions. Small choices made over and over again. And drinking, in many cases, becomes one of those habits. Not always dramatic. Not always meaningful. But consistent. Now think about this. For thousands of years. Before modern entertainment. Before screens. Before constant distraction. Evenings were long. Quiet. Unstructured. And humans, left alone with their thoughts, tend to look for something. Something to fill the space. Conversation. Storytelling. Music. And very often, a drink. Not because life was unbearable, but because it was slow. And alcohol changes the pace. Just slightly. Enough to make time feel different. Enough to make silence feel less empty. And in a world without constant stimulation, that matters. Now, across different cultures, this quiet habit takes different forms. In some places, it's a shared drink among friends. In others, a solitary moment at the end of the day. In some, it's tied to rituals. In others, just routine. But the pattern remains. A small pause. Marked by something fermented. And over time, those pauses add up. Days become weeks. Weeks become years. And suddenly, It's tradition. Something that feels normal. Expected. Even necessary. Now, here's the interesting part. When something becomes routine, we stop questioning it. It becomes part of the background. Like the sound of wind. Or distant voices. Always there. And alcohol, in many societies, becomes exactly that. Not always noticed. Not always discussed. But present. Now, sometimes. Something breaks the pattern. A bad experience. A warning. A moment of clarity. And a person decides. Maybe less. Or none. And that choice is also part of the story. Because history isn't just about what people do. It's about what they choose not to do. And just as some embraced alcohol, others stepped away from it. For personal reasons. For religious reasons. For practical reasons. Creating a balance. A tension. Between use. And restraint. And that tension has always existed. Because alcohol is not one thing. It's many things. A tool. A habit. A ritual. A risk. And depending on how it's used, it can shift between all of them. Now, as the night gets quieter, as everything slows, think about how simple the origin of all this was. A piece of fruit. Left alone. Changing. And a human. Curious enough to try it. That's all it took. No plan. No intention to shape history. Just curiosity. And from that came everything else. Cities where people were paid in beer. Philosophers debating over wine. Empires trading barrels across oceans. And countless quiet moments. Like this one. Where nothing important is happening. And yet. Something is. A pause. A breath. A small shift in how the world feels. And maybe. That's why this story never really ends. Because as long as humans exist. As long as we think, feel, worry, wonder. We will keep looking for ways. To change the moment. Even slightly. And sometimes. That change comes in the simplest form. A drink. Taken slowly. In the quiet. There's a small moment that rarely gets attention. It happens before the drink. Before the taste. Before anything changes. A pause. It doesn't matter where you are. Ancient village. Medieval tavern. Quiet room at the end of a long day. The moment is always there. A hand reaches out. Touches the cup. Feels the weight of it. There's no urgency. No rush. Just a brief hesitation. Because even after thousands of years, there's still a quiet awareness. This will change something. Not dramatically. Not permanently. Just enough. And that's always been the appeal. Not transformation. Not escape from reality entirely. Just a shift. A softer edge to the world. A slower pace. A slightly different version of the same moment. Now imagine this moment in ancient Mesopotamia. A worker sits down after a long day. Hands rough. Body tired. A clay cup is placed nearby. Filled with something thick and fermented. There's no ceremony. No discussion. Just familiarity. The cup is lifted. A sip is taken. And for a brief second. Nothing else matters. Not the work. Not tomorrow. Just the present. Now shift forward. A different place. Ancient Greece. A symposium. Voices in the background. Low conversation. A cup of diluted wine rests in someone's hand. They're listening. Thinking. Waiting for their turn to speak. They take a sip. Not out of thirst. But to settle into the moment. To become part of it. Now another shift. A Roman household in Rome. Dinner has ended. Conversation continues. A servant refills a cup without being asked. The drink is expected. Automatic. Taken without thought. Because by this point, it's no longer a decision. It's routine. And that's where things become interesting. Because the more something becomes routine, the less we notice it. It fades into the background. And anything that lives in the background for long enough becomes part of identity. Now move again. A quiet medieval evening somewhere in Europe. The day is done. The light is fading. A wooden mug rests on a table. No one is watching. No one is judging. A sip is taken. Not for celebration. Not for discussion. Just, because it's there. And because it always has been. Now here's the part that rarely gets said. The drink itself is only part of the experience. The rest is everything around it. The setting. The mood. The people. Or the absence of people. Because alcohol doesn't create meaning on its own. It amplifies what's already there. A good moment becomes warmer. A quiet moment becomes softer. And sometimes, a difficult moment becomes easier to sit with. At least for a while. Now, over time, humans begin to associate these moments with the drink itself. The pause. The shift. The feeling of stepping out of the constant flow of thought. And that association becomes strong. Strong enough that eventually, the drink is no longer just part of the moment. It becomes the signal. The beginning of rest. The start of conversation. The marker that the day is over. Which is why, even now, across the world, in different forms, different cultures, different lives, that same small moment still exists. A hand reaches. A cup is lifted. And for a brief second, there's a pause. Not about the past. Not about the future. Just the present. And maybe, that's the part that stayed consistent through all of history. Not the type of drink. Not the strength. Not the culture around it. But that quiet moment. Right before everything shifts. And that's where the story continues. Not in empires. Not in records. But in moments too small to be written down. Happening again and again. Across time. There's another part of this story that doesn't belong to any single place. It doesn't show up in records. No one builds monuments for it. But it happens anyway. The moment when a drink stops being just a drink. And becomes a memory. Because over time, something subtle changes. At first, alcohol is new. Strange. Unexpected. Then it becomes familiar. Routine. And eventually, it becomes connected to moments. Specific ones. A celebration. A gathering. A quiet evening that felt different for reasons you can't quite explain. And once that connection forms, it stays. Now imagine this in an early settlement in Mesopotamia. A group of people sitting together after work. They've done this many times before. Same place. Same drink. But this time, something stands out. A conversation goes a little deeper. Laughter lasts a little longer. Nothing extraordinary. But enough that later, it's remembered. Not the drink itself. But the feeling. Now move forward. Ancient Greece. A symposium nearing its end. The room is quieter now. Most of the talking has faded. A few voices remain. Slower. More thoughtful. Someone says something meaningful. Or at least, it feels meaningful in the moment. And that feeling stays. Long after the details are gone. Now another shift. A Roman evening in Rome. A gathering. A celebration. Music. Movement. Energy. Time passes quickly. And at some point, the moment peaks. Not because of anything specific. Just because everything aligns for a brief second. And then it's over. But remembered. Not clearly. Not perfectly. Just enough. Now here's the interesting part. Humans are very good at remembering how something felt. And very bad at remembering exactly why. And alcohol plays directly into that. Because it doesn't just affect the moment. It affects how the moment is stored. Edges blur. Details soften. And what remains is the emotion. The warmth. The connection. Or sometimes the opposite. But either way, it becomes part of memory. And once something becomes memory, it starts influencing the future. Because the next time a similar moment appears, the mind remembers. Not consciously. Just a quiet recognition. This feels familiar. And that familiarity pulls people back. Back to the same places. The same habits. The same patterns. Not always for the drink itself. But for what it represents. A feeling that once existed. Now, over time, this creates something powerful. Association. Certain places feel incomplete without it. Certain events feel expected to include it. Celebrations. Gatherings. Endings. Beginnings. Moments become linked. And eventually, the drink becomes symbolic. Not just something consumed. But something that marks time. A way to say, this matters. This is different. This is not like the rest of the day. Now this isn't always intentional. It happens gradually. Repeated moments. Repeated feelings. Until it becomes part of how people experience life. And this is where things become more complex. Because when something is tied to memory, it's harder to separate. Harder to question. Because you're not just changing a habit. You're changing how moments feel. And humans are very protective of that. Now think about how many moments across history have quietly included this pattern. A drink shared. A pause taken. A memory formed. None of them recorded. But all of them contributing to something larger. A long, continuous thread. Running through human experience. Not visible. But always there. And that's why this story keeps repeating. Because it's not just about what happens in the moment. It's about what stays after. What lingers. And sometimes, that's the only part that matters. Now, as everything slows again. As the night settles. Think about how simple it all began. Not with intention. Not with meaning. Just curiosity. And over time, that curiosity became habit. Habit became culture. Culture became memory. And memory keeps it going. Not because it has to, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity is one of the strongest forces there is. Even when no one notices it. Even when no one talks about it. It continues. Quietly. There comes a point in any long habit. When it disappears. Not physically. Not completely. But from attention. It's still there. Still present. Still part of daily life. But no one really thinks about it anymore. And that's what happened with alcohol. After thousands of years. After empires rose and fell. After debates, warnings, celebrations, and regrets. It became ordinary. Not special. Not unusual. Just, expected. Now imagine a quiet town somewhere in medieval Europe. Morning begins. People wake. Work starts. And almost without thinking. A drink is taken. Not questioned. Not discussed. Just part of the rhythm. Like breathing. Like walking. And when something reaches that level, it stops feeling like a choice. It becomes part of the environment. Like the air. Now, this isn't unique to one place. It happens everywhere. In different forms. Different drinks. Different customs. But the pattern is the same. Something that was once discovered becomes accepted. Something that was once optional becomes routine. And eventually invisible. Now here's where things get interesting. Because when something becomes invisible, it becomes harder to evaluate. Harder to step back and ask. Why? Why this habit? Why this routine? Why this pattern? Because it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like reality. Now, in ancient Rome, there were moments when people questioned excess. In Greece, philosophers debated moderation. In monasteries across Europe, rules were written about restraint. But even then, those were moments of awareness. Temporary. Because the larger pattern continued. Quietly. Now imagine a person sitting at the end of the day. They reach for a drink. Not because they've decided to. But because it's what they always do. And in that moment, there's no reflection. No analysis. Just action. And that's where habits live. In the absence of thought. Now, over generations, this builds something larger. A culture where certain actions are simply assumed. You finish work. You drink. You celebrate. You drink. You gather. You drink. Not because anyone said you should. But because it's what has always been done. And always is a powerful word. Now, occasionally, something interrupts this pattern. A voice. A rule. A new idea. Someone questioning the routine. But questioning something invisible is difficult. Because you're not just challenging a behavior. You're challenging normal. And people tend to protect normal. Even when they don't fully understand it. Now, over time, this creates a strange balance. On one side, acceptance. Routine. Familiarity. On the other, awareness. Concern. Attempts at control. And history moves between these two sides. Back and forth. Never fully settling. Because both are part of the human experience. The desire to continue what feels familiar. And the awareness that not everything familiar is always ideal. Now, as the night continues. As everything grows quieter. Think about how many things in life follow this same pattern. Not just alcohol. Habits. Routines. Ways of thinking. Things that began as choices. And became automatic. Part of the background. And once something becomes background, it shapes everything else. Without being seen. Without being noticed. And maybe. That's why this story stretches across all of history. Because it's not just about a drink. It's about how humans build patterns. And then live inside them. Often without realizing it. And occasionally, pausing just long enough to notice. Before returning to the same rhythm. Again. There's one part of this story that almost never gets told. Not because it's unimportant, but because it's subtle. The moment when someone chooses not to drink. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no music. No announcement. Just a small decision. A cup is there. Within reach. Familiar. Expected. And for a brief second. There's a pause. A longer pause than usual. And then. Nothing happens. The cup stays where it is. Now this moment has always existed. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, where beer was part of daily life. There were people who drank less. Or not at all. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just quietly. Because every pattern, no matter how strong, has edges. Places where it doesn't fully hold. Now imagine a gathering in ancient Greece. A symposium. Voices. Laughter. Wine being passed around. Everyone participates. Everyone joins in. Except one person. They listen. They observe. They remain present in a different way. Not distant. Not disconnected. Just, unchanged. And that presence is different. Because while others move slightly away from themselves, this person stays exactly where they are. Now move forward. A Roman evening in Rome. A banquet in full motion. Food. Conversation. Wine flowing without pause. And somewhere in the room, someone sets their cup down early. Not because they have to. Because they choose to. And no one makes a scene of it. Because even in a culture where drinking is common, choice still exists. Quietly. Now shift again. A medieval tavern in Europe. Noise. Movement. The familiar rhythm of voices rising and falling. A mug sits on a table. Half full. And someone doesn't finish it. They leave it there. Stand up. Walk away. And the moment passes. Unnoticed. Now here's what makes this part important. Because history often focuses on what people do. But just as much is shaped by what people decide not to do. Small choices. Quiet ones. Repeated over time. And while one person stepping away from a drink doesn't change a civilization. Many small choices. Over long periods. Can shift patterns. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Now, this doesn't mean the pattern disappears. It never has. But it adapts. Balances. Finds a new shape. Because human behavior is not fixed. It moves. Adjusts. Responds. And even the oldest habits have room for variation. Now think about how subtle this is. No announcement. No record. Just a moment where something expected doesn't happen. And then another moment. And another. And over time, those moments exist alongside everything else. The drinking. The celebrations. The routines. Creating a quiet contrast. A reminder that even in the most established patterns, there is always space for something different. Now, as everything settles again. As the story slows. This part remains almost invisible. But it's always there. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a small shift. A pause that lasts a little longer. A decision that goes unnoticed. And yet, still part of the story. Because history is not just one path. It's many paths. Running side by side. Some loud. Some quiet. All of them real. And sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones that change things the most. Even if no one writes them down. There's a point in the night. When everything slows. Not suddenly. Not all at once. Just gradually. Voices fade. Movements become smaller. The energy that filled the room earlier begins to settle. And what's left is quiet. Now imagine a tavern somewhere in medieval Europe. Earlier, it was full. Laughter. Arguments. Stories that kept going longer than they needed to. But now, most people have left. A few remain. Sitting at separate tables. Or together in silence. Not much is being said. Because everything that needed to be said already was. A cup sits in front of someone. Not empty. Not full. Just there. And for a while, it isn't touched. Because the moment has changed. Earlier, the drink was part of something. Conversation. Connection. Energy. Now, it's just an object. And that shift is subtle. But important. Because it shows something about how humans experience things. It's not just the object itself. It's the context. The time. The mood. Take away the noise. The movement. The shared experience. And the same drink. Feels different. Quieter. Heavier. Now imagine another place. A small home. The day is over. There's no gathering. No crowd. Just one person. They sit. Rest. A drink nearby. And for a moment. They don't reach for it. Because there's no need to mark anything. The day has already ended. The transition has already happened. And sometimes, that's enough. Now, across history, these quiet endings happen again and again. After festivals. After gatherings. After long days of work. Moments when the noise fades. And what remains is something simpler. Not celebration. Not escape. Just presence. And in those moments, the role of alcohol becomes smaller. Less central. Less necessary. Because the mind begins to settle on its own. Without needing help. Now this doesn't last forever. Morning comes. Routine returns. Patterns repeat. But for a brief time. There's a different state. One where nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be changed. And that's something humans don't always notice. Because we're used to doing. Changing. Adjusting. But sometimes. The moment is already complete. Now, if you look back at the entire story. From the first fermented fruit. To global trade. To quiet personal habits. You can see a rhythm. Action. Experience. Pause. And that pause is where everything settles. Where meaning fades into stillness. Where the need to change the moment disappears. Even if only briefly. And maybe that's the part that balances everything else. The quiet after. The space where nothing more is needed. Now, as the night continues. As everything becomes softer. This is where the story rests. Not ending. Just pausing. Like it always has.